Hello, welcome to TEC University's virtual classroom. Today's topic will be about conflict resolution. Thank you for joining us. We'd love to hear from you, but at the end of this discussion, we'll have time for questions and discussion. So please hold any of those until the end of this. Thank you. So conflict resolution, why is it so important? No matter what stage of life you're in, what part of the career you find yourself in, we all face conflict, both in our personal and in our professional lives. The key idea is how we resolve that conflict. Effective resolution to conflict not only impacts our own lives, it impacts the lives of those around us, our workplace, and essentially our mission. So let's get started. Conflict resolution is such a broad topic. We're going to break it up into different categories. Now, as we've all heard before, to effectively solve a problem, you have to define that problem. And we're going to talk about that a little bit today also. But we're going to do the same thing with conflict resolution. What is conflict resolution? What is effective resolution? And we'll begin with what are the main causes of conflict in our lives, both at home and at work. Also, we're going to discuss why. Why is it important to you? Why does it matter if you understand effective conflict resolution? Finally, and most importantly, now that you know what conflict resolution is, what are the causes of conflict in our lives, you also understand why it's so important. You're probably going to be asking yourself, how do I do this? How do I effectively implement conflict resolution methods? And we'll cover that too. So let's get started. So what causes conflict? Just in the span of my saying that, and you seeing this photo, I'm sure most of you are thinking of 30 different causes of conflict in our lives right now. I know I can name quite a few. We always face conflict, but what are some of them? Let's look at those now. The primary one that I would think of, and I'm sure most of you have thought of as well, would be finance. Everyone out there has had some type of conflict with finance, both at work and at home. Who hasn't had a discussion about budget or meeting a budget? Also, if you have children like I do, and you know one child's playing with a toy, automatically the next child will want to play with that same toy as well. But that impacts us too. One major cause of conflict in our lives is the perception or the idea that someone has something and we don't have it. Also, and it seems like a silly example, but it's one that we face all of the time, and it's a great example of effective conflict resolution, is the age-old, what are we having for dinner? What are we going to have for lunch? I don't know. What do you think? I don't know. What do you think? A great example of effective conflict resolution in that case is ending up at a restaurant with a menu wide enough that it meets everyone's needs. And we'll discuss that quite a bit today. Let's look at some other causing factors and how they're related. Personal or professional. As I mentioned already, we face conflict at home and at work. At work, it often comes from unclear job expectations. Poor communication. I know that's one of the main causes of conflicts between my wife and I, is not listening or not understanding what the other person is concerned with. Also, the work environment. All of the factors that we've mentioned already contribute to a positive or a negative work environment, and that can be a conflict in itself. One of the most common causes of conflict in our world, in our personal and our professional lives, comes down to personalities, doesn't it? Different people's perceptions, different people's personalities causes conflict. Understanding that alone takes us a long way into effectively resolving these conflicts and differences. So we talked about the different causes of conflict in our lives. Let's talk about effective conflict resolution itself. This definition comes from Harvard Law School. And this definition, I really like talking about it because it effectively defines what good conflict resolution is. What are the elements that make it effective? So as you can see, conflict resolution is the informal or formal process that two or more parties use to find a peaceful solution to their dispute. Let's break this down and talk about those major elements. First of all, as I said, it's an informal or formal process. Of course, it can happen at home, would be less formal, at work, hopefully a more formal, but the key idea here is that it's a process that we follow. And we're going to talk about that later. There's 6 specific steps that we'll give you to set you up an effective process to navigate something that's difficult as a conflict. Also, it involves 2 or more parties. Now, at first, that seems like common sense. Well, if there's a conflict, there are 2 or more parties, right? But a key idea here is that too often in ineffective conflict resolution, only one party's voice is being heard, or one party is coming up with a resolution. Also, a key idea is that we're coming to a peaceful solution. Now, I myself, and I'm sure everyone tuned in today, we're all affiliated with the military in some form or fashion. So a peaceful solution, you think, well, there are other options, right? But just think of any conflict that we've faced. It must end with a peace accord, a peace treaty, some type of a peaceful agreement to end that dispute. For me, I like to see end results. So we know what the definition of effective conflict resolution is. But how do you see that in place? What are the goals of effective conflict resolution? What are we looking for at the end of this process? Of course, first of all, I mentioned it involves 2 or more parties. The idea there is that we're working towards a solution that all parties involved will agree to. Also, it's a beneficial solution to all parties involved. Of course, one major goal that most people don't think about unless they're involved in that conflict is working quickly to a resolution as possible. No one wants a prolonged conflict, no matter what type of conflict that may be. Finally, and most importantly, an effective resolution to conflict must improve our relationships between the 2 parties involved or more and not hurt them. So that's already quite a bit of information. We talked about types of conflict in our lives. We talked about the definition of conflict, effective conflict resolution. We talked about effective goals. But to summarize that, effective conflict resolution involves all of the parties affected. All of their voices are heard, and we've come to a solution that benefits everyone and that everyone can agree upon. Now let's move on to why. Why do I care? You may be thinking, why should I get involved in conflict? Maybe I should just stay out of it. Well, let's think about that check engine light that may come on in your car. If that comes up, we all know that it's most effective to address it immediately. And you know, if you ignore a problem like a check engine light, it's not going to fix itself. It's only going to get worse. And the longer we let some conflict go on without an effective resolution, the more expensive it can be, the more timely it could be, the more difficult it could be to come to a resolution. And it's the same with our own workplace lives as well. If we're trying to resolve conflict, we need to get involved. Why is that? Well, if you're a supervisor, you can already attest to the fact that it's your job to be involved in effective conflict resolution. And probably most of your day is filled with some form of conflict resolution. A very positive way of looking at this is, as a supervisor, it's your role to help your airmen effectively navigate conflicts and come to resolutions that are beneficial. Also, it's our jobs as supervisors to create a healthy environment in the workplace, one that fosters teamwork. An effective conflict resolution does just that. Like I said earlier, I like to focus on the effects. How do you see if something is effective or not? Well, if you have a healthy environment at work, you have an environment that fosters teamwork, here are some things that you could see. Of course, people work together. People want to come to work. We all know the degradation of mission effectiveness that we have when we have a lack of retention. Also, interpersonal related stress is low. What does that mean? You know, stress can be a good thing. It can help with productivity and healthy competition, right? Interpersonal related stress, however, stress that's between coworkers, is rarely a good thing. And a healthy environment at work will keep from that happening. Also, everyone is valued and everyone feels valued. The key idea here is that everyone is contributing to the mission, and that helps us achieve that mission more effectively. Productivity is high, and team members do not feel threatened in a situation like this. This is a situation where everyone can work together, and the bottom line, as we all know, is mission effectiveness. So how does conflict resolution specifically promote an environment of teamwork? It allows us to understand each other. As I said before, one of the prime causes of conflict in our lives is a misunderstanding of each other, not understanding what affects each other, what each other is really concerned about with a specific problem. Understanding that goes a long way to not only conflict resolution, but conflict prevention. Perspectives and viewpoints can be realized in the workplace. Also, as I mentioned earlier, preventing conflict from escalating is key. Think back to that check engine light I mentioned. We can take a little piece of electrical tape, put over that light, and not see it again. Problem solved, right? Wrong. The problem's just going to get worse if we ignore it, or as we'll talk about later, if we evade it. We need to address the problem as early as possible so we can focus on the mission. And these are the next three things that I talk about. These are my favorite things because you can see how they affect the mission and they affect the workplace directly, such as saving time. We're not wasting time arguing with each other. We're utilizing our time wisely and coming up with great solutions. Also, it reduces stress levels. No one wants to be stressed out at work or at home. Finally, and as I said before, the bottom line is mission effectiveness, and it improves work productivity for every airman involved. So we've talked about a lot already. We talked about what is conflict resolution. We talked about the causes of conflict in our lives. We've also talked about why it is so imperative that you become involved as a supervisor in resolving conflict in your workplace and creating a positive environment. Well, now, hopefully you're asking yourselves, hey, that's great information. How do I work through this process? Part of the definition is that effective conflict resolution involves a process. What is it? Well, if you look online, you'll find all types of reasons and ways and methods that we can utilize to resolve conflict. Some are good, some are not so good. We're going to talk about a very effective and very simple 6-step process today in effective conflict resolution. Those 6 steps are understanding, communicating, brainstorming, choosing a solution, exploring alternatives, and coping. Now, I'll give you just a second to take that in, but we're also going to discuss each of these 6. Let's begin with understanding. What is it that we're understanding? As we began this discussion, I noted that to effectively solve a problem, we must first define it. And well, that's what you have to do here in the process. What is the conflict, and truly understanding what that conflict is? More importantly, how does that conflict impact every party involved? There's 2 sides of that coin, and especially in any kind of communication. All parties need to be able to define their positions and interests, but also all parties need to be able to listen and understand the other party's positions and interests. How do we do that? With effective communication. Effective communication must happen with all involved. Think back to that definition that we discussed earlier, with 2 or more parties being involved. Everyone needs to be able to speak concerning their interests, And on the flip side of that coin again, everyone needs to be able to listen and understand where all parties are coming from in this conflict. Now that we've heard each other, we've defined the problem, we understand what's going on, let's throw out some ideas. And that's what we're talking about with brainstorming. Just toss out as many ideas as you can think of. Come up with as many as possible. Keep in mind the idea of a win-win. What solution is the best for all parties involved? Everyone would win in this solution. When you understand what impacts all parties, we can throw out ideas that may be beneficial for everyone. That's the end goal. Now let's choose an actual solution and follow it. We've brainstormed, we've communicated with all parties and gotten input from them. Let's choose a resolution that benefits everyone the most. The one that gives everyone the most is usually the best one, and that is the win-win we discussed. Step 5 is my favorite because it's often overlooked and it's critical in real life. It's all well and good to stand here and talk about conflict resolution or discuss it in a peaceful manner. You know, if this comes up, here's a good way to navigate it. But in real life, tensions are high. Emotions are involved, people are involved, and it's not so cut and dry. In real life, things don't always go as planned. So we need to explore alternatives. Have a plan B, have a plan C. A key idea here that's often overlooked is that each of your plans are independent of one another. None of them should be planned on the first plan failing. The plan should be made that it's going to succeed. And if it doesn't, we have something that's a completely standalone solution that we can look into and implement. Now that we have several solutions and pathways addressed, again, let's look at the fact that we're talking about real-life conflict. Real-life conflict is never easy. Here we're talking about coping with stressful situations and different tactics. Maybe one party thinks that they have a solution and they will not budge from that. Their solution is the right one and it's the only way. How do you deal with that? How do you negotiate and get everyone to a peaceful working solution? Well, let's talk about negotiating now. In a negotiation, again, going back to step 2, it's all about communication. One thing that I have found is looking at different negotiating preferences and styles. One thing that's been very helpful for me is that we have 5 defined resolution types. And when emotions are running high, I find it's very easy to define what that resolution may be. This answer that we've come up with, let's define it and see where it is in one of these 5 steps and take some of the emotion out of it, and it helps us decide whether that's the most effective solution or not. So what are these 5 categories? Let's look at those now. First of all, we have compliance. Compliance, as you know, if we're all involved in the military, oftentimes compliance is a great thing. An order is given and we comply with it. In a critical time situation, that's necessary. But we're talking about conflict resolution here, where all parties are coming to a solution that they can agree upon. And in this situation, compliance is not a good thing. You have one party winning and one party losing. Essentially, with compliance, one party gives in totally. Next, we have evasion. Once again, I'll go back to that check engine light. Evasion, you've put a little piece of electrical tape over that light and you can't see it. Problem solved, right? This, to me, is the most ineffective resolution that you can come up with. We're going to avoid the person or avoid the issue. Now, in an evasion resolution, no one wins. You get nothing for me, nothing for you. Also, you have insistence. Of course, this is, well, it's my way or the highway. I insist. What's the difference between insisting and complying? They're similar, but it's a little bit of a different action by a different party. In compliance, you have one party actively giving up. In insisting, you have one party who's actively dominating. They're similar, but they're a little different. In both of these, you have a win-lose situation. and they're not the most effective. Next, we'll talk about settling. In settling, both sides settle, of course. You have some for you, some for me. Hey, that sounds pretty good, right? Well, let's look at how we normally use settling in our everyday language, though. If you've settled, like, well, I settled on this solution, it's okay. Really what you're saying is, it worked, it's not what I wanted. The problem with settling is that neither side wins. Here, again, like evasion, you have a lose-lose situation. It's a resolution, but it's a temporary one because no one has gotten really what they wanted here. Finally, we come to cooperation. And this is the goal in effective conflict resolution. You want good cooperation. Both parties are working together, or if there are more, all parties are speaking and working together to come up with a win-win. Everyone benefits, everyone comes away feeling like they've achieved something in this negotiation. Cooperation is the goal in effective conflict resolution. Now, we've talked about a lot of things here. We've covered the definition of conflict. What are things that cause conflict and strife in our lives? We've talked about the definition of effective conflict resolution. It involves two or more parties. Everyone comes to a peaceful solution. Also, we've talked about why it's so imperative that you become involved in your workplace and with your airmen to come to effective conflict resolutions. It impacts the workplace, it impacts our lives, and very importantly, it impacts our mission. Lastly, we talked about the how. One thing in the definition of conflict resolution that I didn't mention is that it's a process, right? That process is the 6-step process that we've covered. Remember to try and implement that. And think about the negotiations that we talked about also. When you're looking at different resolutions, people are discussing those. Where do they fall in those 5 categories? Are we evading the problem, or are we cooperating to come to a win-win? Now, that's a lot of information that we've covered. Hopefully it's been very beneficial to all of you. Now, as I said at the beginning, we've got a few minutes here now that we've come to the end of this. Please feel free to come off of mute if you're mic'd up, or input your questions in the chat. Let's hear if you have any questions or comments. Okay. Well, it seems like we don't have any questions right now. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate you joining us today, and I hope you have a great day. Thank you. We good?